Beautiful. So welcome to this. I have no idea which module it will be in the online program, but it will be somewhere in an online program. I'm doing this live with my wonderful Smart Business Group Mentoring participants, which is fun. They've just all gone off camera and muted themselves so that maybe I can focus. We'll see how that goes. So the first question that comes up is why cognitive functions instead of Myers-Briggs types? And the primary reason that I choose to look at the cognitive functions is that when we read our reports on type, it tends to box us and it tends to come with a lot of stories and assumptions. I want to look beyond the stories. I want to look beyond the assumptions. I don't want us to feel boxed in, and I want us to get to the core of not necessarily who we are, but how we think, and looking at the various voices in our head. And if you haven't been around me long enough to realize that I have many voices in my head, I'm open about that. And so does everybody else. I'm trying to remember if it was 7 or 17 was the average number of voices that we all have in our heads. It's just that most of us don't openly speak out about it. I'm more than open about the many, many voices in my head. And one of the ways that we can engage with, interact with, and get to better know these voices is through cognitive functions. The key benefits of cognitive functions over type include, as I said before, the story versus patterns. So personality types will tell you a story about who they think you are and who you should be, and they can become quite restrictive and quite, what's the word, misused as excuses or reasons or justifications. When we look at types, all 8 of these are available to us, and we'll get into what the 8 are in a moment, but all of these are available to us. It's just our preferences, which expands us rather than contracts us. So when we look at type, often it can feel like we're being squished into a box. Whereas when we look at the functions, we get the opportunity to expand and connect with parts of ourselves that maybe we've been ignoring, or listen to different perspectives that maybe were shut down, denied, shamed. We were given guilt around, we were told we're wrong. And so we get to have a better look at how we think and how we engage with the world and how we engage with ourselves, rather than just falling into the type, which is a story that, quite frankly, I read mine. Actually, I read 3 different variants of mine because I've had 3 different types depending on which profile I do. And all of them felt slightly off and mismatched and unaligned on some level because of the assumptions that are built into the reports. When we bypass the reports and just go straight to the functions, they're cleaner. And so I like them because they're cleaner. They're looking at the patterns, not the story. They look at how we think versus how we act. Again, the type profiles tend to come with a bunch of stereotypes focused on behaviors, rather than looking at our thinking processes and how we perceive the world and how we gather information and how we judge the world and make our decisions. And that's what I'm interested in, is those deeper dives. I think I've talked about contraction versus expansion. So I'm going to move to the next slide. We are going to start with your Myers-Briggs type, which I know might sound a little bit counterintuitive based on what I've just said. However, it is the fastest way to calculate our functions. What I will say is, if you do an online test, it's probably only 60% accurate, and it is worth, and in this video somewhere, this video series that you guys are watching, if you're watching the recording, it is worth making sure you do a type assessment and make sure you've got your best fit type. That will all be covered in another video. So if you haven't watched that video yet, go back, do your type assessment, find your best fit type, and then come and calculate your cognitive functions using your Myers-Briggs type. So when we look at type, there are 4 letters that come through. They're either introvert or extrovert, which are tucked on the side here in next to each of these functions. There's introverted and extroverted functions. There is thinking versus feeling. There is intuition versus sensation. So we've got the T and the F, we've got the N and the S. I think I've just done that out of sequence. And then we've got the P or the J. So you'll have, so I am an ENTP. So extroverted, intuition, thinking, perceiving. within that, we can then calculate our cognitive functions. And the purpose, as I've said, of going beyond looking at type, it's taking us beyond the stereotype, beyond the archetype, beyond the story, to the patterns. And as a coach, as a human behavior enthusiast, it is far more juicy to look at our thinking patterns rather than the stories about ourselves. In the beginning, I loved the stories about myself. Tell me more about me. Tell me what you think about me. All of those kinds of things. We all love to gather those reference points. Now, while I'm still focused on myself and my clients, to be fair, it is now going beyond what I do to how I think. And that's the invitation I give you. Start looking beyond what you're doing to the cognitive functions and the mental wiring and the patterns and the codes, to understanding partly why you do it and partly the thinking that created it. Einstein's quote, "The thinking that created the problem can never be the thinking that solves the problem." And one of the gifts of the cognitive functions, and I know I'm speaking really fast, I apologize for that if you're trying to watch me really fast. Like, I watch videos at 2 times speed. I feel like there's people out there that slow me down to 0.5 speed. I'm not going to stop speaking fast. This is how I speak. I'm excited, I'm passionate, and I apologize for it, and I'm going to keep doing it, which is kind of a really sucky apology. Now I've lost my train of thought. Functions. The thinking that created the problem can't be the thinking that solves the problem. Now, the benefit of this is the thinking is a link between 2 or more functions in play. If we change the functions that we're accessing, then we can change the way in which we're either engaging with the world or making choices about what we discover from the world outside us or inside us. So the cognitive functions, we're going to look at so if you think about type ENTP or ISFJ, or whatever your type is, we're going to start at the end and work our way backwards. So at the end of your type, and again, I recommend you find your best fit type. And one of the ways to do that is to check your cognitive functions and get feedback from someone that knows what they're talking about, or test it yourself if you've got the self-awareness to do that. It is really hard to see the label from inside the jar and self-assess ourselves. So sometimes it's worth getting that external check, and sometimes it's worth doing the internal check, and that will come down to your cognitive functions, ironically. So we're going to start with the last letter. So we either have, so all of these are available to us. I'm just going to reiterate that again. All of these are available to us. This is not our identity. It's not even our personality that we're looking at anymore. We are looking at the way that we think, the way we engage with the world around us, the way we engage with the world inside us, and how we gather information and make decisions, how we judge and perceive. And the J and the P relates to how we engage with our external world. And so you'll either have a judging preference, so you use the external world to make your decisions, or a perceiving preference, and you'll gather information from the external world. If you are a J type, you gather from the thinking, you use thinking and feeling to judge the world around, to judge based on the information from the world around you. And if you're a P, you gather information through intuition or sensation. So there's judging functions, thinking and feeling. They're how we make our decisions based on logic, or based on, feeling is a misnomer. It's actually based on our values, what matters to us that's not logical and tangible. It's an emotion. It's not emotional. It is values is the best word. So it's linked to the emotions we wish to experience, but it's more linked to what's better or worse. What's our hierarchy? How do we scale things? Less based on logic though, and more based on what's important to us, which is another way to say our values. And then we've got the 2 gathering functions, intuition and sensation. And we're going to unpack how to calculate this for you and your type. And I might get one of my lovely live people just to come off mute, or let me know in the chat box if they're happy for me to play with their type as I demonstrate. So a thumbs up from Christy. So I'm going to skip to the calculating. Just before I do that, I'm just going to check in with Christy and Mandy. Are there any questions about what I just said? I know I just went through that very quickly, other than not going through each of the individual types, which are all there, and we're going to go through individually shortly. I just want to get that sense of those 4 letters from the Myers-Briggs are here. We're just looking at them backwards. There's the P and the J, the thinking, the feeling, the intuition and sensation, and then the introverted and extrovert sits in the functions. There's the 8 functions: 2 thinking, 2 feeling, 2 intuition, 2 sensation, 1 introverted, 1 extroverted. I've got it, that was clear, and I got a thumbs up from Christy. Was there anything else you wanted to ask before I jump into dissecting your type? All right, let me find that slide. All right, we will go through each of these types and what they mean. So it's a 3-step process, and I'm going to slow down a little bit because this does get a little bit intricate. There is a cheat sheet here. My husband said, don't teach them how to do it, just give them the cheat sheet. So if you want to just skip to the cheat sheet, you can skip to the cheat sheet. If you want to understand how it works, then hang out with me for a few more minutes. So the first step is working out that relationship with the judging versus perceiving. The second step is working out the relationship with the internal world, and then we're going to distinguish between them. And I get that that makes no sense until you see what I'm doing. So Christy, remind me, you are an ESTP.
Glad I was able to remind you.
Remind me by sitting there staring at me wonderfully, and it comes to me. So your relationship with the external world, so you have a P as your 4th letter. So your relationship with the external world is perceiving, which makes it either intuition or sensation. And so you're an SP, which is the sensation. And you can see down below, this is your cheat sheet. So for anybody playing at home, you can just go to the cheat sheet and go, okay, well, there are my letters, and you can jump to it. So your relationship with the external world is gathering information through sensation. Someone who is an NP, their relationship with the world, or my relationship, our relationship with the world, because I am an NP, is gathering information from the external world through intuition. Someone who is an FJ is using the external value set or hierarchy called feelings in the Myers-Briggs profile to make decisions. And someone that is a TJ is using the external world through a logic process. I hope that's clear for everyone on the recording. If it's not, feel free to reach out. Some of this is worth doing one-on-one, and anyone that wants to book in and do a one-on-one session, there'll be a link somewhere for you to do that, but you can work this out. You can also just Google your type stack, and you can just click below. There'll be a PDF with all of the type stacks laid out in it. So for Christy, your extroverted, your relationship with the external world is done through perceiving and sensation. Is that making some level of sense?
Yeah, so I'm just curious. So all of those ones in that column, the ESFP and ISFP and all that as well, do they all have that as their first?
Yeah.
Okay, interesting.
Well, so either their first or their second.
Okay, right. The I's have it as their second?
Yeah. So the extroverts will have it as their primary, the introverts will have it as their secondary, and we'll get to that in a moment. Just for anyone playing along at home right now, just capture what is your relationship with the external world. Is it extroverted thinking, feeling, intuition, or sensation? So for Christy, yours is SE. And I tell you to write that down, but we will remember that. I will remember that. All right, so now we look at the relationship with our internal world. And again, we're looking at, there's the judgment functions and there's the perceiving functions. They're flipped. So if you are someone who uses the external world for judgment, you will use your internal world for perceiving. We always have a judgment function and a perceiving function in our top 2. It's just the way it works. So if you had extroverted sensation, then it's not going to be introverted intuition or introverted sensation, because you're going to have a judgment function. And it's just the way it stacks. There's no other way. There's a handful of cognitive function tests out in the wild. That's not the word I want. Out on the internet. And they will reorder them in any order. It's not the way our brains work. They don't function that way. They work in pairs, and we'll go into that a little bit more in depth as we unpack each of the functions. So if you've got a perceiving function as your primary, you'll have a judgment function as your secondary. Perceiving's the introversion, perceiving is the intuition and the sensation, judging is the thinking and feeling. And so for Christy, she is an ESTP. And so her secondary function is introverted thinking. So the primary is our relationship with the external world. So you're a perceiver. So your external world is where you perceive. You do it through sensation, which is your S. The secondary is going to be the opposite of that. And so it's going to be so for Christy, who's a perceiver, it's going to be a judgment function, and it's going to be introverted because the other one was extroverted. Whatever we're doing here is introverted. Where they start to play out in terms of whether they're primary or secondary is the introversion extroversion piece, which is where that comes in a moment. You'll see on these lists, if you're in the top two, it's your primary. If you're in the bottom two, it's your secondary. When we get to the map, we'll see that again. So for the moment, for Christy, we've got written down from the extroverted, SE, and from the introverted, TI. And then we come to our map. So step 3 is to distinguish between the primary and secondary based on your preference of introverted versus extrovert. I trust that you listened to my rant in the previous videos that haven't yet been created, just to screw with the timeline a little bit, around introvert versus extrovert and the misnomers around that. And it's got nothing to do with how outgoing we are or how shy we are. And it's just got to do with whether the world around us is what we find more real, or the world inside us is what we find more real. So our first is going to always align with whether we're an introvert or an extrovert. So Christy is an extrovert. And so her first is going to be aligned with extroversion, which was extroverted sensation. Sorry, I'm just going to readjust my slides so that you guys can see this cheat sheet and the formula that I'm going to pull up so that Christy and I can calculate hers. So I'll scroll on that in a second. So we're distinguishing between the primary and secondary based on our preference of introvert versus extrovert. And then we're going to use the follow-on flow to calculate the remaining functions. So once you have the first two functions, the rest fall into line. There's no working out priorities. There's no navigating. It's just once you've got the first two, the rest flow on from that. So our third or our tertiary is, or our 10-year-old, depending on the namings that we're going with, is the opposite of number 2. The fourth or the inferior function is the opposite of 1. The fifth is the inverse of 1. The sixth is the inverse of 2, and so on. The opposite is the alternate either T or F or N or S, and the introversion extroversion swaps. And this is why we're going to play with Christy so that I can demonstrate this in real time. The inverse just swaps introvert for extrovert. So if we leave that there and I scroll down and I scan out just a little bit so we can see both. All right, so I'm just going to swap Christy as an extrovert. So just on that extrovert introvert where we can see both, extrovert comes first for the extrovert, introvert comes first for the introvert, and then they alternate until you get to this one, and then they switch and they flip backwards. So Christy is an extrovert, so we're going to use the extroverted cheat sheet. Her primary was extroverted sensation. or her extroverted function was extroverted sensation. It becomes her primary because she's an extrovert. Her secondary was introverted thinking. Is that all making sense? Any questions at this point? Because I know I'm moving. I forget that I now do this fairly unconsciously and it flows fairly readily. So the opposite of TI is FE. So it's an extroverted. So the opposite of introvert is extrovert. The opposite of thinking is feeling. So TE is the opposite of number 2. So it goes in the tertiary position. Then the opposite of S is N, and the opposite of extrovert is I. So into that 4th position goes NI. The way to check that you've got this accurate is you should have an S, a T, an F, and an N. There should be 2 introverted, there should be 2 extroverted. And so if you've got that, you're probably on the right track. Then we do, and we'll do Mandy's as well in a second because that'll help just cement it. Then we don't do NE there, I'm doing my own. So NE is the...
I was going to guess, is it SI the next one?
It is. If
okay,
I'm,
cool.
Yeah. So, oops, hang on.
And then extrovert, so if it's the opposite, it would be TE, is it?
That's correct, yep.
Okay. And then obviously then FI's that. Okay, interesting.
Yep. So you can see they're all paired and partnered and it just flows easily. So if we just, oops, hang on, I moved that the wrong way. If I move that the right way and swap for the introvert one, so I'll leave Christy's there. So now we've got Mandy's. Mandy is an ISFJ, so ISFJ, more for my memory than for anything else. So if we scroll back up here, we've got the J, so it is a judging. It is an F, so it is FE, is her extroverted function, and ISFJ should be underneath that. So it's a judging, it's feeling, the feeling is extroverted. So FE is her extroverted function. So now we're looking for either N or S. She's an ISFJ, so it's S, so it's SI. So her primary is introverted, so it's the SI. The secondary is extroverted, which was FE. And then we do the same. So the third is the opposite of 2, FE. The opposite is TI. And then we want an extroverted function of NE. So again, we've got S, F, T, N. And then we just continue along with the stack. I've put N in the wrong spot again. N goes down there. F goes here. It'd help if I picked them up in the right sequence, wouldn't it? And then the T and the SE. Clear as mud.
So if S is in the 1st position, then
Yep.
it's also in the 5th position and so on. So
that's correct.
1, 2, 3, 4. It's the same in the 1, 2, 3, 4 and the second 4, but it's the opposite in introvert, extrovert.
That's it. That's it exactly. Yeah. Yeah. Any questions from you at all, Mandy? You can throw it up in the chat box so you can come off mute.
All clear. So
All clear? Cool.
Yeah.
All righty. So what does all of that mean?
Yeah, I'm spellbound.
So
Yeah, I find it fascinating, particularly Mandy, like because you're like the opposite to, or I think literally the opposite to Amy, and close to the opposite to me.
Yeah, overlaying the functions is always interesting. Oh, I just mucked up those slides. Let's try that again, Amy. Yeah, so we've got the 8, and there's now the sequence. Now, as you study these, or if you choose to study these further, lots of people buy into the stack. If I just go back to that stack of either Christy or Mandy, it doesn't really matter which one, as being a hierarchy. Now, there is an element of hierarchy to it. The dissecting what we call loops is far more interesting in how they interplay with each other. And so the top 2 are our sweet spot. It's where we play most easily. Often, though, we've got shame or guilt or fear or shutdown around one of those functions, and we'll ignore it, or we get consumed by our outer world or our inner world, and we fall into a loop, and we're going to go into all of that in way more detail. In a nutshell, obviously, we could continue unpacking this for a long time. I'm going to stop this recording for the people watching the recording. We're going to have a conversation about this, and then we'll move on to the next video you'll get will be the loops and how the functions interrelate. If you've got any questions, come and ask in the Facebook group. If you want to unpack your own a little bit more in depth and check in that you've got your best fit type because your functions aren't seeming to line up, book a one-on-one session with me and we will unpack that.